My talk is Game of Authentication. We're going to go to Kuberos, not Kerberos, Kuberos. We're going to explore some cities and applications and how authentication works. And just remember, when you play the game of authentication, you win or you get breached. So first we're going to go to Kubernetes and look at JWTs. So this is probably the best way to do authentication with Kubernetes. You want short-lived tokens. You want to make sure that you're asserting your identity, so who the user is, who the group is. Great feature in 1.30 is going to be the ability to have multiple issuers, so you're not constrained to a single issuer. Certificates, please don't use them. They're a security risk. There's been audit finding for several years because Kubernetes doesn't know how to do revocation. The Client Go SDK does not know how to do hardware certificates, so you couldn't deploy certificates correctly even if you wanted to. Kubernetes impersonations are a really powerful tool. You set up a reverse proxy, authenticate, and then inject headers. The great thing about impersonation is being able to manage access to managed clusters where OIDC is not an option. Also really powerful for debugging. So if you've ever used kubectl --as to be able to test to see if your RBAC works, you're using impersonation. The dashboard. So the dashboard doesn't really have its own identity, not if you're doing it right. So you can either issue service account tokens, which is really insecure, because those tokens either last forever unless you delete them out of the API server, or somebody's going to breach them. So you set up a reverse proxy, and you let that reverse proxy, like an OAuth 2 proxy or Open Unison, inject the token, so that way it's working on your user's behalf. Or you can use impersonation to be able to use the dashboard securely on managed clusters. GitHub, if you're using the GitHub API, you've got two ways to do it. You can use a personal access token, so that's a token issued to you. It does have an expiration, but they're usually pretty long-lived, which means if you lose it, bad things are going to happen. You can also use GitHub apps, which is the preferred way. The way you use a GitHub app is you download a private key. You use that private key to do MTLS authentication up to GitHub, which then gives you a short-lived token. Of course, this means you now need to use session management, but the nice thing is that token is much shorter-lived. I think it's 10 minutes. So let's look at some of the applications in our cloud-native Kuberos, excuse me. So Grafana, very popular, supports OpenID Connect and can handle a proxy with headers. So all sorts of different authentication in there. But if you're using the Community Edition, there are no teams, and you only have 2 roles. And you have to map your group that you want to have access in to that role. So you got to make sure that you've got some intelligence in your identity provider. Prometheus and Alert Manager, there is no security. But you still don't want everybody to have access, so you throw a reverse proxy in front of it with authentication. Make sure you're authorizing who has that access, so that way, while Prometheus and Alert Manager don't know who you are and don't particularly care, at least your security people won't be throwing fits. ArgoCD, we're going to spend a couple minutes here. You can do ArgoCD SSO with OpenID Connect to get into the UI. It also works with the GUI. Now, of course, or the CLI, excuse me. With the CLI, you're not going to distribute that client's secret to users, which means you're going to use a public endpoint. Make sure you've got PKCE required, PKCE, on your identity provider. The latest version of ArgoCD supports PKCE for both the CLI and for the GUI. If you're going to be using the API for automation, it's a combination of Kubernetes objects and Argo's own built-in API. The built-in API requires a static token. If you're going to use ArgoCD to manage multiple clusters, you can use either static service account tokens, which is an anti-pattern, or you can use the Client Go SDK. I've got a link here to a blog that I just wrote about using credential plugins to be able to manage access to remote clusters securely. AWS. So you got secret session key, pretty standard. We've been dealing with this for years. The great thing about AWS is it supports a security token service. So if you want to, say, have a GitHub action that manipulates an AWS service, you can tell AWS, hey, go trust GitHub. And it'll support both OpenID Connect and, interestingly enough, SAML 2. The nice thing about SAML 2 is you don't need a public endpoint for it to work. If you want your EKS clusters to talk to AWS, AWS will provision a public-facing identity provider, mount those tokens into your EKS cluster, and then the AWS SDKs are smart enough to take that token and exchange it for an identity. So that way you're able to use your local policy or your local identity instead of having to have a static secret token. GitLab. So it supports SSO, Kerberos, LDAP, whatever you want to access it with. It's pretty flexible there. But for API access, it only supports personal access tokens. They do have an expiration now, which means you want to automate how you generate those tokens and how you rotate them. Vault, also SSO with OpenID Connect, all the other usual suspects when it comes to authentication. If you're going to be talking to the Vault API, for instance, if you're using the Kubernetes external secrets operator, you could use a static token. That's, again, an anti-pattern. The other thing you can do is use your local service account token, hand it off to Vault. Vault will do a token review request. So if somebody tries to use a token from a pod that's expired, that will fail. If you feel a little overwhelmed by all of this and thinking there was probably more, which I did not cover because this is a 5-minute talk, you're right. So go ahead, take a look at Open Unison. It's our open source project, authentication into your cluster, security token service for managing access to all these different systems, and namespace as a service. And come by booth and say hello. Thanks, everyone.